All right, welcome back, everybody. Today is day 6, and we're going to take a look at a couple of extra features that we can apply to our text adventure kind of template that you guys would be using for your either Curious and Curiouser or Desert Escape for your week 2 project. Going to do a quick review of the stuff that we looked at in last lecture, and then we'll build up from there. We'll talk about adding a back once feature, which if you take a look at the rubric, some of these items are listed like you have 4 different blocks: the required section, then basic features, intermediate features, and advanced features. The basic, intermediate, and advanced are intended for you to go and do additional research outside of this class to bring the score all the way up to 100. Just doing what I've done in class so far, you'll be sitting at I think it's an 80, which that's fine. The idea is push you to do more research on your own, experiment with this kind of stuff, ask questions, etc. But you'll notice that the back once feature is listed under one of those above and beyond the required section, so it's kind of a freebie in this case. We'll also go through, and I alluded to this in last lecture, where it can be just irritating trying to look at all that text, from the week 2 project inside the console, trying to jump back and forth between seeing it in the console, because the console, the main lines only give you two rows of text, and then you have to click on it to see all the rest of the text down there in that little further information window at the bottom, and then to enter the key. Right, key presses are only registered when your game window has focus. So constantly jumping back and forth can be kind of a pain. So one of the features we're going to take a look at in this lecture is basically creating a text box that's out there on our screen. We'll kind of customize a little bit, map it to our screen real estate, maybe fiddle with the colors and that kind of stuff. That way you can better see what's going on so that you're not being forced to leave the game view to the console to actually read whatever was actually printed. So you'll be able to play the game from start to end right there in the main game view. Color will also play into that. I'll show you this neat little feature in Unity where you can actually fiddle around with the text that's not only being printed to the console but also to the screen, so that text box. Give it a bit of flair so it kind of pops out. So maybe you emphasize the individual commands, the individual keys that the player could press. And then we'll take a look at what's necessary for the submission, 2 different approaches you could do, which will also be augmented by whatever the instructions say. So they tell you how to start the project and create yourself a custom folder, and that folder, the instructions tell you how to go and find that folder, then find a project and zip up accordingly. So we'll take a look at that, but then we'll also take a look at just exporting the entire project, all of its internal content. And then we'll also look at dumping that into a test project, just a blank test project, so we can verify that what we have written, what we're about to submit, what we think is correct, is actually correct. So I'm not, on my side when it comes to grading, not staring at a blank .unity scene, which I can't do anything with, and you end up with a 0. So we'll make sure that we've got all the files necessary for the submission, and then you can go through and use that technique to verify pretty much any of your other projects as you go forward. Just a little second, a second quote-unquote machine, a second project. The instructions, each one of them refers to testing this stuff out on a second machine. Well, some of us don't have second machines, so if we pop up an isolated, clean project, we can dump our stuff into that and go from there. Okay? So last lecture, day 5, we talked a little bit about exceptions, things to be aware of if you ran into one, either a null reference exception or an index out of range exception. Basically, every bit of code after that point would fail to run. So it's always in your best interest, just like with errors, stop what you're doing, look at the error, look at the very first one, try to figure out what's going on, fix it, and that way you avoid any kind of snowballing, cascading issues throughout your code. We went through and looked at the Twine project, the farmhouse, looked at how those nodes were represented over in the Twine website, right? We also looked at the actual rendered HTML version that you could actually click on those links and kind of jump around. I showed you how we could take those individual nodes, extract out both their command headers and their body, which also included the different commands where we could go from any given node, and then applied that to C# code, right? Actually did the port so that we could verify that everything looked correct. To do all that, right, to get those nodes into our code, I basically went through and played this up as though it was a one of those old choose your own adventure kind of books. So we were not only creating the book, we were creating each one of those individual pages and then telling it where to go. You know, choose this door, go to page 5. Choose that basket, go to page 10. That kind of concept. So we created a page class with 2 private variables excluded away from public access. We didn't want anybody to touch those private variables directly. We added a couple of get accessors, right, the properties that were public, so that we could ask the individual page for its information over in the day 5 file. And then we created a custom constructor that would set these things up whenever we first allocated and inserted that individual page into our book array. Back over on the day 5 file, we had a book array, which was just an array of the individual pages that we allocated. We not only allocated the book array itself, but the individual pages as they were being populated. We used, now focusing on the day 5 file itself, the actual core functionality of this thing, we used variables to track the current and next heading, and then once we established that a next was detected, not null and not empty, then we said go basically prime ourselves for that location, display that information, but then swap where current and next is and reset next to be nothing. That way we are basically waiting for a new next location. To do that, both the allocation of the book, the pages, and how we're going to see that content on the screen, where we're going to do our for loop that scans, that iterates across the array, we created 2 custom methods, one to fill in the array, fill in each one of those pages, and then we had a method specifically for rendering our information. Now, we could have just as easily gone through and said debug.log of this book sub this page dot body, like up there inside start, and we could have done the same thing inside update in a number of spots. But the idea is we want to wrap up this functionality so it only ever has to be written once. That way, if we ever decide to change this stuff in the future, we just have to change it in one spot, and those changes propagate through the rest of our code. So that's why, what was it called? Let's see here. That's why render story was capable of doing both the next location lookup and the rendering, both finding and rendering of the individual story piece, right, the body. And we reused it in a couple of spots. We used it once up in start to get our prime initial location, and then we used it again anytime we updated the next heading down inside update. Okay, then basically stitching all this logic together, each one of those nodes over in the Twine UI, we basically said from any given node, where can we go based on key presses? So we're both inspecting our current location, we're using the knowledge that this particular button was pressed. Those 2 pieces of information combined tells us that we can go somewhere. And then we set up our next variable to say that's where we're going to go. So if I press this button at this current spot, here's where I will go. And so we use a series of if, else, if conditionals to guide that overall flow. We also noticed that some of those nodes had the ability to loop back onto themselves, or to the next node over and then back onto themselves. So, for example, the car and the check the farmhouse, you could go back and forth between those 2 nodes just by pressing the C for car from the farmhouse, or vice versa, and a different key. So to achieve that kind of concept, that we could hit the one key but possibly go to different locations, or we could handle the different key elsewhere and possibly go to different locations, we started using the OR to basically say if I'm here or I'm here, then do something. And that basically gave us total control over how our just general storytelling, the flow, the functionality, the control actually operated. So real quick, I'm just going to scan through these slides, and then we'll actually take a look at this stuff in code. So if you want to review the slides real quick, you can just burn through the first part of this little video. So to achieve the concept of back once, all we need to do is add one more variable that's going to maintain our previous location. Then, just before we set up the current variable, the current location, the current heading to the next heading, just before that operation, we preserve where we are currently at inside the previous variable, the previous value. So now we'll have 3 strings at the top of our file: previous, current, and next. Then in this particular example, the key press X is going to give us the ability to go back one step. Now, all we have to do if you just look at the rest of the input block, no matter where we're checking current, when we want to go somewhere, doesn't matter where, we always assign the next heading as our location we want to go to. So in this case, if we press the X button and we want to go somewhere else that happens to be currently stored in the previous, all we need to do is set next equal to previous, and it'll update automatically when render story comes along and says, I've seen that there's a next location. What is it? It's irrelevant that it's the previous. It's just going to go ahead and make that update. The only caveat to this is that this will get you the points for the rubric, but it's worth noting that this particular feature, as it's designed, it's not a bug. It only maintains 1 step's worth of history. So pressing X once will take you back 1 node. Well, where you were just at is now the previous location. So pressing X again will take you forward to that location. Pressing X again takes you back to where you just were. So it basically, once it's pressed 1 time, will ping pong you back and forth to that one pair of nodes. You'll never.
Last channel button on a remote control.
Say again?
The last channel button on your remote control.
Yeah.
It only takes you back to the last one you pressed.
Exactly, because it's only remembering that one thing. Now you can definitely experiment with other solutions. Some students have come along and said every one of in this case, the page nodes maybe has like a parent where it came from, and instead of restoring a previous, they restore that. In other cases, every one of those if checks where we're checking current and we assign next, you could additionally go through and assign a previous there based on where you came from. Then you would omit some of that extra checking that we're doing, or not checking, but the extra assignment later on inside our for loop. So there are a number of different ways to approach this to achieve greater functionality. So it's not just step back once, but it's step back for every individual command. Now it's important to note that kind of technique is different than the back all feature. The back all feature specifically says use some kind of collection type. So either an array or a list to maintain some kind of a history that you can actually push and pop through. Now this is like the back button on your browser. You can hit it a number of times and it will take you back. You can hit it forward a number of times. But you also have to be aware, if you want to do something like that, if you back a number of times but then deviate for the future, you take a different branch, suddenly your forward history has been altered. So that kind of additional research, how to A, deal with arrays in that respect, B, how to potentially deal with lists in that concept, looking into how to push and pop information to it and track that kind of information, or just assign where you are, where you were, that kind of stuff. That is just additional research that you could look into. And again, that's why it's an advanced feature, because it's worth X number of points and it requires advanced R&D to figure out. Okay, so when we start looking into the getting the information printed out to the screen, I'm going to cover a number of things, right? We're going to get ourselves involved in a canvas. We're going to take a look at how that differs from the game object right, let me back up a second. So you're going to create a canvas that maintains all of our UI children, but you're also going to notice how that differs, and the children differ from normal game objects, where we're dealing with regular transforms off of the inspector. You're going to be looking at rect transforms, and the idea there is rectangular, as in the 2D UI. We'll also be looking at the fact that as soon as you create this thing, it's going to be massive, right? Your scene, your camera's sitting down there at a basically 1 unit scale of, 1 Unity unit scale, but then the canvas itself is going to look massive. Well, that's because Unity approached this from a 1 pixel is equal to 1 Unity unit. And so if you will go through and see how we can jump back and forth between the scene view and the game view and resize those, and you'll notice that your canvas is going to start to manipulate its size. That's because it's a 1-to-1 mapping. All those pixels from the game view, whatever that aspect ratio, that real estate is going to be what that canvas actually represents. We'll also, I'll cover, but I won't really go too far into it, the 3 different kinds of modes that the canvas can be put into. You can easily create this thing to be just a standard overlay that shows you information no matter what's going on. You could actually put this more into your scene, but like attached to the camera, so you can put 3D objects in front of it, but it behaves a little differently, right? Or you can actually put these things, these canvases, into your scene as if they were like text bubbles, like chat bubbles above individual objects, NPCs, treasures, that kind of stuff. So I'll take a quick moment to look at the documentation so that you can see, if you wanted to, going forward, you could definitely incorporate this kind of tech and these kinds of settings in your own project. You could, the sky's the limit with what you can do with these things, and it'll give you an idea of where you can look for, what does this setting do? What does this setting do? What are the customized settings to achieve certain end goals? Let's see here. We'll also take a look at a couple of different ways to actually create these things, because at the end of the day, the way Unity has constructed itself is you're dealing with game objects, and everything on a game object is a component. So the engine itself has wrapped up a number of these things for us that, like, if I wanted a text object or I wanted a button or whatever, I have a UI subdirectory in terms of creation that I could just say, give me a button, and it's going to pre-configure all the stuff necessary. But I could, if I wanted to, and these are special cases, like I could just as easily come through and create myself an empty game object and apply the text or button component, just that, like, kind of like what we've done with scripts, component scripts. You do the same thing and basically create your own. So you may not, for whatever feature you're looking at, right, you may not want the built-in functionality, or you may want to remove certain bits and pieces. So you have the ability to kind of, like Legos, take this piece out, put another piece in, and kind of rewire it however you see fit. This is a more advanced topic to get into, so I'm not going to go too far into detail or in depth with it. I'll just show you that there are a couple of different ways. So if you accidentally remove a component or something, you'll know you're not totally hosed, but you can just go in and like re-add it or recreate it or whatever. And like I said, I'll go into giving our code what we see on screen and in the console, just a little bit of flair, a little bit of pop, so that we can, both see our bits of information jump out, but also make the UI a little bit more lively. And I'll show you the documentation for that as well, so you can take a look at the different bits. There's a whole bunch of other things you can do. So if you ever wanted to reference where that stuff was, you'll now know where that's at. Then we'll take a look at the how you would go about doing the actual submission. Okay, so that was a quick wrap up of those slides, and what I'm going to do now, jump into code, and we're going to take a look at the back once functionality. So in this case, the day 6 lecture is actually building on to the day 5 lecture. So we have a couple of options. One, I can just start writing directly in my day 5 and basically kind of forget what I changed from the the lecture before, and because I'm not tracking any kind of deltas between the two files, it's all right there. I don't have any kind of version control going on. I'm not seeing version 1 from day 5 and version 2 from day 6. The other way of doing this is to just go through and basically copy the old content with subtle renames. So in this particular case, just because of organizational purposes, that's what I'm going to do. So I've got this day 5. We already saw that it was running with all of our previous information as far as the day 5 script and page. So what I want to do is come through and select the day 5 scene, duplicate it, and it automatically, part of the Unity engine, it understands you probably wanted the next number in sequence, so it's just going to duplicate that number. Now, all I did was duplicated it. I'm not actually in the script right now, or sorry, in the scene right now. So I just need to double-click to load up that scene. Now, I don't want to talk to day 5 anymore. I want to actually build this functionality on. The idea here is that if you wanted to, you could take your day 5 script and compare it against your day 6 script and see what kind of changes we made here so that you could then maybe apply these to other projects. So what I want to do is, number 1, I want to remove this day 5 script just so I don't accidentally deal with it again, make the mistake of dealing with the wrong script. So now, down here at the bottom in my project directory, I want to take this day 5 script and I want to duplicate it. Now, just doing that initially is going to kind of freak Unity out for a split second, because at the moment there are 2 day 5 classes in my overall global space, right? When Unity goes to compile its code, it looks at every single file that's considered part of this project, and it does not matter if there's an error in some random other file. Your whole project will not compile until you fix that. So in this case, Unity also went through and said, oh, you probably mean day 6 in terms of naming convention. That's correct. That's what I wanted. But now I need to make sure that I change that day 6 class name right there to be day 6. So I'm going to double-click the day 6 script. And over here inside Unity, inside Visual Studio, I'm going to take this day 5 and I'm going to change it to day 6. Okay? So now if I save, jump back to Unity, this error should go away. And now I can come up to my day 6 scene, that game object that I had a second ago, and pull my day 6 script over and drop it on. Okay? And I should be able to play this and C, B, and so on. Okay, so we know that bit of functionality works. So this whole step here was nothing more than demonstrating how you could potentially clone bits and pieces of your project, but stuff to be aware of if you clone it with the same name. When we get into the week 3 project, I'm going to be going through and showing you how to create levels for your Arkanoid project. And when you do start creating this stuff, you'll be cloning those scenes. The scripts are all going to be unique across the thing. They're going to be shared across every one of the scenes. So there's no worry about using the wrong script and messing up the naming, but it gives you a quick heads up as to if you just select the object in your hierarchy or your project view and use Control-D on the keyboard, it will duplicate it. You may or may not have to change the name, but it's there so you know how to approach it. Edit, duplicate is where that key is as well, where the menu item version is. Okay, so now if I jump back to my code, and let's see here. I'll address that particular question in just a minute. So what we need to do to achieve the back functionality is a few things. Up here at the very top, if I start scrolling down to where I have my current heading and my next heading. Just before those two items, just to kind of keep the sequence going, right? I'm going to do public string s prev, as in previous, heading. Okay, I'm not going to assign it to anything initially, but then I'm going to scroll down to where update is, and I want to put the X responding code at the very bottom after all of this, after all of these other get key down bits of response code, but before the render story. So here, else if input dot get key down key code dot x. And now, like I said earlier, I just want to restore the previous into where we're intending to go. So where do we intend to go? That's the next heading. Where do we want to go from? And that's the previous heading. Okay, just that one little bit of code. Now, we need to actually capture the current into the previous so that we can make this bit of code happen. Right now, if you were to press this, it wouldn't really go anywhere. This would be a null assigning to, in this case, this would be empty because we've already detected it down here inside our render story, right? We saw it once, we set it to nothing, but prev heading was defaulted to null at the very top of the file, so it's not going to do anything. We would hit X all day long and nothing would happen. So now we need to actually capture where we currently are just before we change it. So here, we're changing current heading to be something, right? It's going to be the next. So I need to capture current before it gets lost to me. So I know I want to save this in my previous variable. So s previous heading equals s current heading. Okay? So that gives us that memory of where we were so that we can recall it later and say that's where we want to go. So now, if I save this, jump back to Unity, let it compile, we now get another entry over here for previous heading. So if I start playing, if I wake up, I can go to the car. Now notice over here, my previous heading got updated to where we just were. So it's now saying wake up. So something to be aware of is I've not updated any of the text. So as far as me being the player is concerned, I wouldn't have any clue that X actually does anything. This is something you'll want to update inside your week 2 project so that the player or whoever's grading looks at your code and says, okay, I understand that this button does something. Otherwise, I mean, you could say, oh, it's a cheat code, and you just kind of have to hunt around. But that's an easy excuse. So the idea is give your user the visual feedback that this button now does something. So now, if I come through and I hit X on my keyboard, you'll notice I get wake up printed again. But I still... Okay, so if I turn on collapse, you'll notice this is not collapsing for 2. Right? We're seeing wake up. Well, what's the difference? Well, if you look very closely, as I toggle between these 2 selections, my printout further information window down here at the bottom, the last little bit that says where it came from, right? The first 2 lines are what's being printed out. The third line is what caused the printout to happen, debug log. The next one is where the printout came from, render story called debug log on line 113. And who called render story? Well, for this first wake up, start called it on line 40. But this second wake up, when I hit back, was called inside update on line 98. So it's worth noting that even when you have collapse toggled, you'll still receive different bits of information because you're receiving the trace, right? The call stack from where Unity, from the engine level down to your code, where something happened. Like what was the path of execution? So you can use this to kind of hunt down, like, is there a problem with this first printout? Well, if there is, I could double click this and see, okay, it's coming from here. I know it's render story, but because this bit of code is reused multiple times, I might not be able to rule out this block of code as being my culprit. But if I look at this stack, okay, so render story is where I lost the trail, right? Imagine I'm a bloodhound hunting something, or a Sherlock, I'm looking for clues. I know render story is called in both of these scenarios. Well, what's the level above that? In the first one, it's start. So if I, looking at this log, start on line 40, if I scroll back up to line 40, boom. So I could, if I had some kind of special error there, I could start trying to hunt it down that way. Looking back at the second log, update line 98. So if I scroll down to line 98, I see that's where the second one is called. So I can use this kind of thinking to basically isolate, is there a possible problem when I call render story from my start versus my update? What section of my game, what module, what compartment, right? We talked about compartmentalization, encapsulation, that kind of stuff. Which of those subsystems, sub-areas of code is possibly responsible for what's going on? If I see the same bug in both locations, I could probably narrow that down to there's probably something wrong inside render story. But if it only happens on one of the first two, maybe there's a problem with like my initial next heading up at the top, so starts version doesn't detect it. But it updates properly for the next one, so maybe pressing a key reset it to some correct value. That kind of example would be if I misspelled one of these words, right? Your code could tumble different ways. So start sees it one way, probably doesn't print anything out, but you start mashing buttons on the keyboard, and eventually you get lucky and you hit, C for car, and you realize, oh, we may have been in wake up, but maybe something failed. Like maybe I typed wake up wrong up here. But it's also worth noting, depending on how I write my code, these checks where it's saying if I'm equal to this other heading, and if it's doing comparisons, like right here, if the current heading equals wake up, well, if I misspell wake up here, this current check will never happen. And because pretty much the rest of my game is governed by leaping to other nodes from wake up, if I screw up that node, those comparisons, I'm done for the rest of this game, and I have to stop and figure out what's going on. So I could then start to kind of backtrack and say, well, what's going on with start? Is there a problem there? Maybe not. Maybe I wrote the next heading wrong. Maybe, down here at the very bottom, I potentially wrote the wrong words or the wrong case as far as page 1 is concerned. So these are common errors. These are very common errors that you'll run into trying to get this project or your week 2 project up and running. So if you're not seeing anything or it's not responding to the way you expect it to, just double check your spelling, double check your case, double check your comparisons, because chances are there might be some little slip up, a single equals versus a double, a lowercase versus an uppercase. And here, because we're dealing with string literals, right? Strings that we wrote, it is literally the string. We're not dealing with variable content. We're not dealing with user input, right? I'm not asking you to type the words wake up inside a serialized field. I'm responding to key codes. Those key codes won't change. The strings won't change. So we don't, in this example, don't need any of that string to lower stuff. So just omit that completely and just deal with raw one-to-one comparison strings. Okay, just things to be aware of, generally speaking. Okay, so let's see here. We've looked at constructing the back once. We see it functional. That code, you pretty much be guaranteed that it functions throughout the rest of the project. I'm not going to go through that. Save us a little bit of time. So the next thing we want to look at is getting content onto the UI, onto the screen via the Unity UI. So to do that, I want to do a couple of things. When you're dealing with UI construction, right, Unity gives you the ability to do a lot of this stuff directly in code. You could attach these scripts, attach these objects from code. You can programmatically do all this stuff. But as designers, we tend to be more visual people, not necessarily dealing with code, so we want to deal with probably like a drag and drop interface. We want to use Unity's tool set that it's given us to just rapidly get this stuff up on screen. We don't want to worry about all the nuance of what are the parameters for this canvas or this text object or whatever. So we need to do just a little bit of prep work over in Unity. So if I jump back to Unity, stop playing. This might be a little interesting given the real estate that I'm currently dealing with. So what I can do is I can tear these windows out if I start getting constrained, but this might work perfectly fine. So we'll see. So what I need to do is add a text object because that's the thing I want to target. I want to throw my text instead of to debug log. I want to throw it onto my UI here. So I need to, over here in my hierarchy, either go to create an UI or game object UI or right click UI, and I want to create a text object. All three of those menus take you to the same spot. Now you'll notice three things were created when I asked for that text object. A canvas with the text object as a child, an event system, and the text object itself. So canvas represents where these 2D objects are going to actually be placed. The canvas can be thrown around in your scene. It can have different like properties depending on what you're trying to do. You can make it more of a HUD. You can make it more of a 3D object out there in your world for like text bubbles and whatnot. But you'll notice that if you go just kind of jump back and forth between a regular game object and the canvas, you'll notice here in the hierarchy, in the inspector, you have a transform versus if you select the canvas or any other child of the canvas, you'll get what's called a rect transform. That's the whole 2D side of things. But you'll notice with a regular transform, you just get the X, Y, and Z or Z for position, rotation, and scale. So that's a standard transform matrix, right? Transform matrix. So we have these three individual components. They are vec3s behind the scene. A canvas, you'll notice it still has the position X, Y, and Z, and then down here at the bottom it also still gives you rotation and scale, but it additionally has all this extra stuff regarding anchors and pivots and a width and a height. This is all stuff that's necessary when you're dealing with more complex UIs. Like, where do these objects link up to? Can they be constrained to different areas? Can you move anchor points to make it always 10% into your screen versus always attached to this other object and using it as a parent? That kind of stuff. But what you'll notice is there's a little message up here at the top. Some values are driven by another object. In this particular case, the way this canvas is currently set up, down here under the canvas component, you'll see where it says screen space overlay. This message that is being driven by other things and in this mode is telling me that my UI, my game screen, the UI is being controlled by that width and height. So if I take the scene view, I've got my canvas selected, I press F to select it, I can kind of move this around and look at what's going on. Now, if I detach, let's see here. Yeah, so these two side by side, you'll notice as I scale the game view, the canvas over here inside my scene view is also scaling. You'll notice also that as let's see here, these values over here that are currently grayed out that I can't touch whatsoever, I can't change them in any way. You'll notice like 100, let's see here, 100, 200, that kind of stuff. If I then slide this over, you'll notice those values changed. Because it's reflecting whatever the game view is, that's what's controlling the aspect ratio, the width, height, position, that kind of stuff. So it's worth noting that, right, if I come into my scene here and I right click and just create a 3D cube, okay, I want to reset this cube back to origin. And actually, Z is facing down the axis, so I need to spin my camera back around. Okay, so at this point, if I select that cube, you'll notice it's over here, but you'll notice if I kind of look up, that canvas is massive. And again, that's simply because it's using Unity units. One Unity unit is equal to 1 pixel in this case. And so if I were to take this cube and duplicate it, whatever the width of this screen is, that would actually be the width of my canvas. And same thing for height, duplicate it vertically. So you could map it like that. So it makes trying to convert this stuff in your head a little bit easier if you're dealing with just units directly. So in this case, I don't need that cube, so I'm just going to delete it. Okay, so I talked about there were other possible modes you could go into. If you switch over to screen space camera, you can actually take one of the cameras from your scene and kind of put this canvas attached to it, and that gives you the ability to put 3D objects and other 2D objects in different sorting orders as your camera would see it. This overlay means no matter what gets placed where in terms of Z depth and layer ordering, that kind of stuff, right here, sort order, no matter what you put in your scene, your 2D stuff, your UI is always going to be on top. It's overlaid across the entire scene. So useful for later on if you want to build some kind of a visual thing inside your camera. You can also go into world space, which will push this whole canvas as if it was a regular game object, right, with a normal transform. It'll push that into your scene, meaning you could have a cube out there with a little text bubble kind of hovering above it, and you could interact with it if it was a button. Do all these different things. So you're dealing in the space of the UI technologies, but you also have the ability to push it out there into your 3D world. Okay, so to interact with these objects, if it's a button or something, you can, like a toggle, a checkbox, that kind of stuff, that's where this event system comes into play. The event system, if it's missing from your scene, buttons and that kind of stuff simply won't respond. So if you're ever running into that, why is my button not working? You might have missed one of these things. So usually when you create a canvas or create a text object or anything like that, it'll come along for the ride. But you could also right-click UI and get these things in here manually, right? So I said a second ago that a lot of this stuff, they all start out with a game object base, and then there are a bunch of components attached to it. So if you go looking through this list, you'll notice text script is a little different than the scripts that we've written, but it has a lot of the same, like if I was to write font inside my script, I'd probably see font like this, or some of these other variables. So knowing that these are nothing more than components, you can click these cogs, these gear icons, and see where you have similar bits of functionality. Some of these things like edit script actually won't work because you don't have direct access to the engine under these circumstances. But you can do different things. Like if I accidentally remove, a script, I collapse this. I could easily just come back in here and say add component, scroll down through my list to UI, and add that individual thing, right? And at this point, because I only have one, it won't let me do another. But that's just something to be aware of. Some of these game objects, just generally speaking, can only have one of a specific type of object attached. So I would need to create another object. So right-click, create new. This is going to be my dummy object. Notice it starts with a regular transform. If I take this object and put it underneath my canvas, let's see here, and add a UI text, it then becomes a rect transform. You'll notice, though, that compared to the original, different objects will actually scale differently. They'll have different properties. So you can kind of toggle back and forth and take a look, like what's going on with my position, my anchor points, that kind of stuff. So you can rebuild these things, but it's a little bit more advanced. So I don't need this second game object, so I'm just going to delete it. But one final thing before I delete that, you'll notice all I did was created a game object and added a text, but I also got this canvas renderer coming along for the ride. Some of these objects require other things to function, and so Unity will put that on there automatically. If I try to remove this canvas renderer, it'll tell me, hey, can't do that. It's required. So there's actually an attribute that if you know for a fact your class must have some other class, you can put that attribute onto the class itself, and the second you drag your script over, it will immediately add that, just like it did here with the canvas renderer. Sometimes you might not want to do that because that takes a little bit of the manual work out of the way. You might want to make absolutely sure that you do that, right? Because you're in the learning phase right now, you want to manually do that, see it happen. You don't want the system to automatically do all this stuff for you necessarily, right? So in this case, I don't need this game object, so I'm just going to delete it. Okay, so let's see here. Just reviewing my notes because there's a few different bits and pieces in here that kind of make things a little interesting to look at. So you'll notice, just right off the bat, I can't do anything with my canvas because it's being driven by the game view. But you'll notice my text object is way down here, and it does not show up inside my view. So I need to reposition that. Well, I could select this text object and try to manually reposition it, right? Drag it all over the place. Yoink. Right, and then just try to manually position it. But Unity realized that I guess in GUI realized that you would want to anchor these things in predefined locations, predefined offsets of like 10% from a border, that kind of stuff. So they gave you this square right here. If you click that, it's actually a bunch of preset locations based on screen real estate that you can go. If you, up here at the top, under anchor presets, you'll notice Shift and Alt actually do different things. If you press and hold, right, you'll notice that the little blue dot in here appears. Now the little blue dot, if I switch back to 2D, right, that circle in the center, that's the pivot. Okay, so selecting through here these different controls gives me different control aspects of the individual object. You'll also notice if I've got pivot toggled up here at the top, then I can manipulate it, versus if it's in center, I can't touch that. I can't touch the circle there. So it's worth noting that with this box clicked, you get this other box of presets, and pressing and holding Shift will give you an adjustment of an individual component off of that UI object. Doing the same thing with Alt also makes the UI change a little bit and gives you different options. So you're welcome to it, and you can press both at the same time and get additional options as well, right? Just toggling back and forth. So it's worthwhile to go and like experiment with this and see what it does, because you'll notice these four little triangles here in the dead center of the screen. Those are the anchor points. That means if I resize my window, it's going to actually scale my UI. If I manipulate where this center point is, I can control how it pivots, how it rotates in different ways. These corners, I can change its overall size and that kind of stuff. So for this particular example, I just want this text box to be mapped to 100% my screen. I want the anchor points, I want the pivot into center, I want it just mapped. So what I'm going to do is click on the center here again, and this option down here in the bottom right corner, I want it, but I also want to change the pivot and change the position. So clicking or pressing Shift and Alt changes to this arrow in 4 directions, as well as the little yellow anchor points in the corners and the pivots in the center. So as soon as I click this, you'll notice over here in my view, this rectangle will be placed right in the center. These 4 triangles will be snapped to the 4 corners. The blue corner points for position will be snapped to the corners as well. And this blue circle in center for my pivot should be right here in the dead center. Okay? Click, and it's mapped. So I have the ability to come through and move this thing all around my scene, and experiment with where it goes. This is totally up to you, depending on the UI that you're constructing. You have full control over this. Okay, so I'm just going to put it back to this last bottom corner, Shift and Alt held. Okay, now that's fine. That gets me to where I need to go as far as like if I start resizing the screen, right, my other, let's see here, zoom out a little bit, pull it over. You'll notice that just like the canvas a second ago, because I'm currently mapped to the canvas, they're both going to resize properly. Okay? And actually, by the way, I'm going to Control S to save because I haven't saved in a while, and it would suck if I had a crash and lost all this work. So now that it's at its current location mapped inside the canvas, I want to actually do some manipulation to the string itself, right? The text that's going to be presented to my screen. So a second ago, I had clicked on this text object to this text component title to collapse it. Now I want to click on it again to drop it back down. Now I want to customize this. One real quick note: if you're over here working in your scene, like earlier when I created that cube, you notice those big white bars, and if you have any kind of complex UI, you'll start to notice that inside your scene view, as you're constructing these scenes, your UI is actually there too. So you have all this content inside your active construction yard. That might get a little distracting, especially if you're trying to grab one specific like 3D object to move, but you keep selecting your canvas object. Well, how do you get around that? You have a couple of different options. Over here in the upper right corner where you have account, layout, layers, that kind of stuff, if you click this layers and go looking down through this list, right, this list associates itself with the layer dropdown on each individual game object. Now, all this UI content is part of the UI layer, so it's part of this canvas, and if I scroll through looking at the canvas, it's already on there. But what you can do, over here along the right column, you have two sets of options. This eye icon means whether or not it's visible. So if I come down here to the bottom for the UI and I click that, suddenly over there in my scene, the entire UI is gone. I still see it in my game view, but now I can work with the scene without the UI getting in my way. Now let's say you need it to be there. Maybe you're lining up something visually in your 3D scene and your 2D needs to be there, but you don't want to select the UI objects accidentally, right? You want to lock it down. Well, just to the right in this very grayed out, possibly hard to see, is a lock this current layer from picking. If I don't have this selected, right, and over here in my scene, if I just click inside the canvas, or I click about where that text object is, I get something in there, right? I select something. And clicking through, if it's multiple objects, it'll kind of cycle through what you're clicking. It understands these are layered objects. So I'm selecting canvas, I'm selecting text, and I'm clicking in the exact same spot. Well, maybe I'm trying to click a cube, and I don't want this canvas or this text to be selected. So I can come up here to my layers, hit lock, right? And now, if I start clicking through, I don't get a selection of this object anymore, right? That was the camera and the light right there. But as far as the interactivity, it's basically locked out. So you don't accidentally select and move your stuff around. Now you still have the ability to come over here to your hierarchy and select it. That's perfectly fine. So workflow-wise, you can kind of limit what you're doing there. So if I turn that off, it comes back, and then I can select it. Okay, cool. So this is fine. It gets my text object on screen, but now I want to actually make that text appear a little better, right? Upper right or upper left corner, not exactly the best as far as reading, so I want to go ahead and do a little bit of manipulation to this particular visual. I want to go through, and so watching over here in my main game view, I can select center the text, set it to the middle, right? And if I wanted to, I could increase the font a little bit because I'm dealing with a limited aspect here, a limited resolution. I won't do that, but you can absolutely, make it huge. Okay, just undoing that. And then if I wanted to, I could also manipulate the color. All right, so I can make it like red or whatever. I'm hitting Control Z to undo each one of those actions so I don't deal with any of this other possible manipulations. You'll also notice that this background is kind of ugly for what I'm looking at in terms of text. So if I select my main camera, change this from skybox to solid color, I can then go in, same thing. I can start manipulating what the background color is. Okay, so we'll go with this. Yeah. Actually, we'll go with a kind of a grayish blue. That's fine. Okay, so now that I have a target for which to actually put this text into, right? I have the visual component that I'm going to look for in code. I now need to actually bind my code to it. I need to have my code look for that object in my scene. Now, I have a couple of different ways of doing this. One, for example, if I had a number of text objects all over my scene, I could name them differently, so I hunt down a specific game object. I also have the ability, if I know that I've only got the one text object out there, I can just look for that one specific type of object, right, a text object, and find it. There's also a variant of the call, I'll show you here in a second, where you can look for an array of these things, right? If you had multiple text objects but you didn't care about the name, you just wanted to kind of set them all just randomly, you could do that as well. So now that I've got my text proper, I'm going to save this scene and jump back to my code. So now, to interact with the UI, I need to do a few things. The first thing is I need a code representation of that object to actually link to. So up here at the top of the day 6 script, just below where I do my previous, current, and next strings, I'm going to give myself a little bit of space, and I'm going to create a text object. But you'll notice typing text does not give me any kind of text inside this dropdown. Well, that's because this text object, the information about it, that library, lives somewhere else. So I have a couple of options. I either know where it's at and write the code manually, or if I hover my mouse over the object, I can see doesn't exist in this current context, show me potential fixes. So the potential fix, in this case, looking down through this list, I don't need to spell check it, I don't need to generate it, I don't need to fully qualify it, I don't need this media type name. I'm dealing with Unity. So, I'm talking to the engine, it's inside the UI namespace, so I need to use that namespace. So clicking this button will add this using Unity engine.ui to the top of my file. Notice it becomes teal now. So if I scroll back up just real quick, you'll notice line number 4 is using Unity engine.ui, automatically plugged in. If you knew that that code was needed, you could write that yourself, and everything else after this would start functioning just automatically. So now this is a type just like our classes were, our candy class, our page class. So now I need to actually give it a name, an identifier. I'm just going to call this the screen. Right? Just very brutally straightforward, just screen. So now I need to actually set that variable to something. I need to do some kind of lookup in my scene for the canvas for that text object and actually attach it. Now there's a couple of ways to do that. I want to do this, by the way, before I do any of my other things, any of my allocation, any of my rendering, especially before my rendering, because if I try to touch this object and it hasn't been set, I get a null reference exception. I could technically do it after the allocation, but in this case, I want to stick with the paradigm that I'm doing any kind of Unity scene searching, looking up objects. I want to try to get that stuff out of the way at the very beginning, so I'm not mixing my logic with whatever Unity is possibly doing. So to start dealing with the UI, I need to assign that screen variable to something. Now, 2 ways to approach this. I'll show you both and then comment out the one I don't want to use. I can look through my scene. If I jump back to Unity, I can look through my scene's hierarchy for a specific named object. Instead of, let's say this object, I said this was my main text instead of just my regular text, right? Main text. I could also rename it from up here, right? Main text X. But if I click off of that, that change won't persist. I have to main text X and then hit enter for it to actually push that change down into the hierarchy. I don't want that X at the end, so I'm just going to delete that. Okay, so main text is the name of this game object, and this component is called text. So what I can do is scan my scene, scan my hierarchy for a game object named main text. So to do that, I have to call out to a global method, game object dot find, and inside here, the thing I want to find. In this case, I called it main text. Okay, now that is going to return me the game object, assuming it found it. If it doesn't find it, it's going to be null, and the next operation can potentially crash me if I've renamed my object. So keep that in mind. If it doesn't exist, same kind of thing. So from this game object, looking back at Unity, I get this whole object. Now I need to find this component down here at the bottom. So I can say dot get component, and I want the angle brackets version, right? The less than greater than, so I can specify what type I'm looking for. And in this case, I'm looking for a text type. And because get component is also a method, I need my parentheses. And that ends this line of code, so semicolon. Okay. Now this will go out there in my scene, find that object, and if it's, hopefully it's got that component, this also will, if the component doesn't exist, I accidentally deleted it, whatever, screen will be set to null, or actually it won't change because it's already null from a second ago right here, line 38. This will simply return null if it doesn't find it. So just something to be aware of. This one line has two potential points of failure. One, if it can't find this object. Two, if it can't find this component. The other way of dealing with these objects out there in your scene is to directly look across the entire scene for a specific type. Now I know in this version of the code, I only have one text object anywhere out there in my scene. If I modified this, had multiple ones, had specific ones I wanted to name specific things, I'd have to modify this code. Totally dependent on what you're trying to do here. The way I would scan my scene for a specific type is calling out directly to find object of type. And I want the angle brackets version again. Same thing. I'm looking for a text object. And this will return me a text. Right? My tooltip is already saying off of the object, which is what I'm in right now. That's why I don't need to specify any pre-information. Kind of like right here where I have game object.find. Game object is like the high level. This is what a game object class is. The find object of type is actually, let's see here. Remember I was talking about with classes where we had this, that variable representing this instance? Well, when you're dealing with Unity game objects, lowercase g is the object that you are currently dealing with. So because I am a mono behavior, as this script, I'm attached to a game object. So the object I'm talking to is actually this game object. Right? So it's kind of like this, except this would be the class. So here, I have different kind of scanning abilities. Right? So I can do get components off of that as well, which game object here is what would be returned by find, right? So you can kind of chain these things together. Others are actually globally, these methods are kind of globally out there. So some of the stuff, if you tried to, let's see here, and some of these names, because they're so similar, sometimes, you can just experiment with it real quick to see, did it exist in this library off this object, just to reinforce that to yourself. So game object, capital G, find object of type, right? Same method that I created just a second ago. But you'll notice when I completed that line of code, it came through and it shaded this game object just a little bit darker. That's telling me that I don't really need that because it understands where that's coming from. GameObject.find, on the other hand, absolutely has to have this. It's just where these methods live. Okay, so here where it says GameObject.find right there in the teal, right there in the dead center, versus this one which comes off of object. It's known globally. So the GameObject dot here is completely optional, and it'll tell you, hey, you don't need it, right? It can be simplified. That was the tooltip. Show potential fixes, just delete. Okay, so it's worth noting sometimes these things live in different spots, so the use of certain keywords is optional. So in this case, screen is what's going to be returned to me because it's the one text object out there. So screen equals GameObject find object of type. Now I said a second ago that if I had multiple of these text objects kind of scattered throughout my scene, that there's a plural variant of this. Well, wouldn't that mean objects? There are multiple objects out there, same type, multiple objects. Put an S. Find objects of type. But you'll notice just adding that S also caused an error because it's telling me this returns an array, not just one. So I would have to come through and actually create, boom, an array. Now it would function. This first line breaks because that returns just one. So it's worth noting you have the ability to hunt down these things, singular or plural. Okay? And like I said, I only need one of these in this particular bit of code because I only have the one text object. So I'm just going to comment out the first one, leave it there for posterity's sake. Okay? So now that I've hopefully found my text object on that component out there in my scene, I can actually put text into it. Now, currently, the only place we're rendering this information is inside this render story. So if I, just a real quick jump to it, if I put my cursor here, and I believe it's F12 on my keyboard, right, it will jump me to that bit of code. You could also click on the method wherever it's being used, right-click, and go to definition, and it'll take you there. Right, there's the hotkey, F12. So it's a quick way of jumping around your code if you need to. If it's a lot of code, you're trying to hunt something down. So debug.log, a log, a specific page, and then the body. Well, that's the information going to our console, but I also want to see that presented to my screen. So now that I have a screen object, right, a text object that lives somewhere out there in my scene, I can say screen, but I need to talk. If we jump back over to Unity real quick, screen is this text component, but I want to talk to a specific thing inside this script, right? In this case, it's text right here at the top. So if I jump back to my code, that dot is going to give me a whole bunch of different settings. If I scroll down and look, a number of these things, full screen height, blah, 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 you'll see, actually, just as a quick note, notice screen changed to uppercase S. That's not what I wanted to work with. I wanted to work with the variable, not what's basically representative of my whole screen, like window, that kind of stuff. This object here is actually something completely different. It's a Unity Engine screen, access to display information. That's why those options weren't correct, right? DPI and full screen and that kind of stuff. So dropping back down to lowercase s, now might just have to go through and rename that to something else so it stops doing that conversion. But notice here, IntelliSense has detected there are two different versions. So this screen for the Unity Engine versus this screen, my variable type. That's the one I want, so I'll just enter on it. And now if I press the dot, I get all those game object related things, text object related things. So scrolling down through, looking, I have a number of like font options and just all kinds of different options on here, and you're of course encouraged to look through the inspector to see this kind of stuff, look at the documentation, see what's available. In this case, I want to talk directly to the text part of that text component, and I want to assign it to the information that I'm currently sending over to debug log. So I'm just going to copy the A book in page body, paste, and in that line of code. Okay, so now if I save, okay, jump back to Unity, and once it's done compiling, save this scene, Control S. Now if I start playing, the information being sent to the console is also being sent right up here to my screen. Now, with this screen focused, or with this window having focus, if I just click or if I press the individual buttons, right, C, B, H, I'm no longer having to necessarily come down here and take a look at what's actually going on. I can see my information here on screen. It's worth noting, though, that if you decide to do like 2 prints in a row, you'll get 2 prints down here, like, welcome to blah, 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 and then do something. But up here on the screen, only the most recent thing will be printed out, because it will overwrite whatever was printed out just a second ago. So, worth keeping in mind. Okay? So that gets us our information onto the screen. And that wraps up the ability to see this stuff live without having to jump back and forth between the console. So the third thing that I was going to go over was the ability to add just a little bit of flair to this information being presented to the screen. So down here, each one of these commands, this is part of a query later on, right? We're checking the commands. We don't actually print this information, but we do print the body. Now, I want to somehow visually emphasize maybe my title, maybe the individual command key that I'm expecting. So, actually, one split second, got ahead of myself. The UI stuff that I was talking about, come on. It's in the slides. You saw it at the very beginning. The UI output, there's a link down here to the UI system. If you click that, it'll take you over to the UI portion of the manual. Looking through this little section here, canvas, interaction components, animation component, or visual components, interaction components, you'll get a lot more information about each one of those settings, about each one of those features. Visual is strictly for stuff that can render things. Interaction is things like checkboxes, buttons, toggles, etc., sliders. So you can go through and take a look at like what the code should look like. There's samples in here. There's further information on how these things actually get laid out, right? What each of these render modes actually means. So if you need further information or are just curious, that's where you can go for that information. Okay? So with regard to color in the text, right, we had these 2 other links. I said that debug log and the UI, the text itself, are capable of understanding rich text, specifically tags, formatting, that kind of stuff. Using this first link, if you go to the documentation for debug log, just scroll down, you'll notice right here as their second example, they show you how to colorize the output that you're seeing on screen. And just like normal tags within like HTML, you need to turn it on and then turn it off. So you can further take a look at, right, down here under rich text, you can look at a bunch of different information. Yeah, same link. You can look at a bunch of the different options so you can customize this kind of stuff going forward. So what I'm going to be mainly taking a look at excuse me, is the BI and color tags. And here you can manually type in the word like you saw in the example for debug.log, or you can override it and use a specific color setting. Because, like, for example here, if I said green for my win, for example, this green is more like like a washed out green because it's using 80 instead of FF as far as the value. These numbers, by the way, if you jump over here to Unity, find a color well, those numbers that you saw in the other screen correspond to this hex value. They're the hexadecimal version of this information. So sometimes a green might be more over here, right? About a half an inch off, and you want the 100% green. So sometimes you need to either manually punch it in, or if it's given to you like lime here, you can manually go through and do that. Pick that different option. So in this case, I want to just real quick give myself a little bit of emphasis saying like where I'm currently at. So I want to give a bold and italicized format to this wake up. So to do that, I can do the angle brackets, add a B for bold, angle brackets, add an I for italicized, and now I need to turn off those two tags in reverse order. So angle brackets, but using a /I to turn off the italics, and a second set of angle brackets with a /B to turn off bold. Now, if you mess up the order, maybe put B first, then I first, when you print this out, you'll actually get those tags printed right there in your text. So just swapping those will sort that out. Now, if I jump back to Unity, run this, you'll notice that my wake up is actually bold and italicized. Same thing down here in my console. It's bold and italicized. Okay? Well, that's cool. That gives me a little bit of visual pop to what's going on. But I said I want to emphasize what's going on with the individual commands. So here, C and F, I want to give just some kind of a highlight to them. So let's say, I don't know, magenta. And if I look at the color table, magenta, same as fuchsia, is this particular value. I'm going to go ahead and use the word at this point. So C is what I want to emphasize, not the square brackets around it. So I include the opening angle brackets and say color equals magenta. And on the right side of the C, when I want to close it off, I add the angle brackets, a /, and just say color. That's the tag I'm turning off. Okay? Now I could additionally do this exact same thing, but instead of using color magenta, the keyword magenta, I can use the hex code itself. So angle brackets, I'm going to start this for the F, angle brackets, color equals, now if I jump back to this documentation, I see that the magenta code is #FF00FFFF. So if I copy that, I can paste that in, #FF00FFFF. Okay, and on the right side of the F, just turn off color. Save. Jump back to Unity. And now, if I did that correctly, playing will both tint the C and the F the same color using two different versions of that call. And then down here in my log, I see C and F, and in my little further information window down here at the bottom, I further see information. Interesting. Looks might be impacting the way the that might be a bug. Have to look further into that. A bug in the engine, not with the stuff I just wrote. The tag might be messing with the selectability there. But anyway, so you can use this to kind of emphasize or call out specific things. In a sea of logs, you might need to add a little color to emphasize your specific one for that one moment. Again, we use bugs to temporarily find stuff, find what's going on. So it's always useful to be able to turn this, it's always recommended to turn this stuff off when you get ready to jump back into like team-based stuff, as well as the fact that it can start to shave off frames per second. It can have a performance hit by adding so many extra logs. So now, just to wrap this up, the highway for freedom and the inspect basement for lose, it'd be nice to kind of make those two pop a little bit. So I'm going to call out the highway header. All right, I'm just going to add a color equals, in this case, lime is the one I want because green is actually a little washed out. It used 8 instead of FF, or 80 instead of FF. So I'll go with the lime. It'll make it pop more. And then turn off the color tag. Okay, so freedom green lime, and then inspect the basement will be my lose scenario. So tag color equals red, and that red is 100% red. It doesn't have any kind of tinting to it. And turn off the color tag. Okay, so if I save this, jump back to Unity, play, I can check out the car, break the window, find a highway, freedom, and you see it's green, it's emphasized. If I stop running and play again, and this time lose, check out the car, go to the farmhouse, inspect the basement, and inspect the basement, I've lost. So you can use that to kind of emphasize a little bit of text there in your output. So now the final thing is to go through and actually look at how this project would be submitted. Now you should always go back to the documentation that we have here in FSO and take a look at what it actually says as far as how to start the project, because the submission usually bases itself on what the naming convention, the folders, the hierarchy, that kind of stuff was. But in this case, you have the option to, per the instructions, find that location and submit it. Now the reason behind it, much like the fix me, I only needed the one single source file. If you created this stuff correctly, your named folder would have both the page and the text adventure, right? It would be your name underscore text adventure or whatever the instructions actually say. So giving us just those two text files is good enough. We'll do the scene stuff and go from there. The other option is if you could find that file, right? Those two files in the folder, and then right click on the folder and say send to compression, submit that zip, and then we would have those two files. The other option is to actually export the content. So in this case, I know I've built a lot of this stuff. So my day 6 is the target. It's got all the scene stuff, but then also the day 6 script and the page script. So, oh, by the way, per the instructions, it asks you to just submit that those two scripts. But because we went above and beyond and added all this UI stuff that only lives inside the .unity file, inside the scene file, you'd also want to include that as far as your submission. But per this project, there should only be 3 files in it at all. It should have started as a new project. You would have a scene file and you would have your two script files. So all this extra stuff that I've got for the days, the zombie adventure, the notes, all that stuff wouldn't exist in yours. So if you intend to give us the visual side of it, you can do that. Maintain the scene. It'll maintain all your settings. It'll also maintain the links, should maintain all the links to the files and everything. So the second option to get this content to us is with nothing selected, right? If you've currently got something selected, and let's say your view was full of stuff and you couldn't find an empty space to select, or you didn't click out here into nothing, one way is to click into nothing, right? Click so nothing is selected. The other way, if you currently have something selected in either your hierarchy or project view, is to press and hold Control and click on that selected object. It'll deselect it. The giveaway here is that your inspector is going to be completely empty. So with your inspector completely empty, with nothing selected, if you go up here to Assets, Export Package, this dialog is going to give you all the content that's inside this particular scene. Well, I don't want any of this Facebook stuff. I don't want any of the zombie stuff, the notes, any of the other day stuff, the candy stuff, none of these other scenes. So I'm going to click None to deselect everything. Now, you'll notice down here, Include Dependencies. It should be smart enough, if I click on Day 6 Scene, because I want this visual, I want this UI that I just created. If I click that, nope, okay, it's not smart enough to find that. So another possibility that makes this a little bit smarter. This, the reason I said don't select anything was because this is context sensitive, right? So depending on what you've got selected will make those dependencies a little different. So if I have the day 6 selected and I say export package, it will understand just this day 6. Apparently it doesn't. Nope, never mind. Ignore what I just said. So with nothing selected, go up to Assets, Export Package. Deselect everything. Now in this case, I know I only want the scene and I want the 2 scripts that I've constructed. That's page and day 6. Okay, so those 3 files, nothing else. Now if I click Export and go ahead and dump this onto my desktop, I'm just going to call it Test Week 2. Okay, and you would name it, last name, first name, Week 2 project, or whatever the instructions say if you chose this approach. Now what you'll see is I've got over here on my desktop a window opened up automatically for me with the Unity package already selected. Okay, cool. Now I know this has different bits of information in it. So what I can do is over here inside Unity, discarding. Also, just as a side note, I forgot to mention just a second ago, I think, make sure all your stuff is saved. If it's not saved, you could potentially miss certain things. And then you're left asking me, well, I thought it saved. Why didn't it work on your machine? Because maybe you didn't save. So save all your stuff, both the scripts and the scene. So the script, there's no asterisk here, so we're good. And there's no asterisk up here in the title, as well as right here next to the 6. So we're good on that front as well. So that would have saved all the or would have exported all the latest saved content to that scene. So now, if I just go New Project, Testing Week 2, and I want to put this just over on my desktop. Okay, 2D, 3D doesn't matter. I don't care about analytics. Create the project. This will create me a brand new empty test project. This is basically the same process we went through when we looked at both the Scoville and the Fix Me, right? After we fixed all that stuff, we double verified to make sure that our Fix Me stuff would have been correct. So making an isolated project that's away from the one we were currently working in means we won't possibly have cross-project contamination, right? So any of those extra files that we were working with are gone. This is a completely brand new scene. So now, over here on my desktop, with Unity open to nothing, if I go to my desktop, double-click that Unity package file, I will get this little UI. And notice those 3 files in those 2 locations, the scenes folder and the scripts folder. If I import that,
make sure you only have one instance of Unity open as well.
Yeah. So in this case, when I closed down Unity a second ago, it also left Visual Studio open. So that's also part of it. Is I'm not actually dealing with this version of Visual Studio. So I can go ahead and just shut that down as well. So now, if I wanted to just double check the code that I wrote, I shouldn't change this. Keep in mind, this is like imagine this is read-only, right? You're not going to mess with this because any changes you make here won't exist inside that Unity package you just made. So you would be submitting me something to me, and then other changes would persist outside of that commit. Okay, so now I can go through and just look through. Yes, it looks like I've got all my stuff. My 2 files are all correct. I can go through here in Unity, double-click my scene 6, just verify, yes, the day 6 was attached. All of my UI stuff seems okay. And if I run, I get my stuff here. And just one real quick play test. Car, brake, highway. I win. Cool. Stop playing, start playing again. Farmhouse, basement. Cool, I can make it all the way to the end. So I just, in like 10 seconds, verified all of my stuff functioned in terms of playthrough, and now I verified that Unity package on my desktop was indeed full of the correct bits of information and worked in a brand new project. So this would be a file that you would be able to rename and submit if you wanted to go this route, or the route described in the documentation as far as like submitting just that folder zipped up. Actually, you would need to right-click this file, the Unity package, and also go to Send to Compressed, and then you would submit that zip. Okay? So that concludes all the material that I had for this lecture.
You already went over the review.
One other thing. Let me just we've kind of mentioned a few of these different things as far as the instructions up here at the top. Pay close attention to them because they give you different locations for different things, different naming convention, that kind of stuff, conventions. Tips on how to resolve things if you're running into any kind of issues. But as I mentioned earlier, there were those 4 sections in the rubric, the required tasks, which if you watch and repeat after me with modifications using your 2, whichever of the 2 you pick, the Desert Escape or the Curiouser, you'll meet that required section. You'll get those, I think it's 80 points for this particular project. Going above and beyond that, if I scroll down through this rubric listed, you'll see the basic features. You'll then see intermediate down here, and then advanced. So basically, whether or not your code actually functions, if it does what you've said it will do, if it goes above and beyond, each one of these individual columns is going to represent the different quality, right? So superior, above average, satisfactory. It's a modification of points by 20% on each run, and if it totally fails or isn't present or whatever, then it's 0 for that particular set of points. You can go through each one of these lines and just see, like, does my game follow what that flow chart inside the zip actually looks like? Do each one of my nodes, based on the key press that it says will take you to the next node, does that actually function? When you look at, like, there's a twist feature in here. Did you take one of the ending nodes, like for the Desert Escape, for example, it has a door and a basket that are they're dead-end nodes. They're not technically lose or win nodes. And so you could add a twist to say something, hypothetical, there might be something in or under or near the basket. There's another bit of functionality, another bit of feature that's, let's see here. So there's a new ending, right? It's just one kind of step. Let's see here, 2 options. It's another leap to go forward. But then there are other ones down here, like creating a new feature, and each one of these columns indicates, like, does it have all 6 entries to make it that much more complex? Does it weave throughout the overall narrative through other branches of the story? Did you create it but maybe only used 3 to 4? So each one of these features has a slight variance as far as, like, what constitutes 100% of the points. You can still attempt it and achieve maybe partial credit for it, but just read those items carefully, because they definitely can give you hints as far as like how you would achieve certain things. Yeah, so the points total after the top section, after the required section, you'll be sitting at basically 80 if you do the required, and you have 20 more points to make up through those additional 3 sections. Pick and choose, do whatever. You could have 5 points here, 10 points here, 15 points there, and just accumulate them. When in doubt, maybe try another feature, because what you think might be the 100% of that task might actually fall into a different category based on how the rubric is written. So, you can go above and beyond and add more things to your stuff to achieve additional points. It'll cap at 100 points, but you could easily go over that. It just gets pulled back down. You'll see with the week 3 project, you can do all the required stuff, and that'll get you 75 points. But if you go above and beyond, some of those additional features are like additional levels. And for every level above the first one that we give you, or the first 2 that we give you here in class, if you go above and beyond, every one of those levels is like 5 more points. So you could easily duplicate a single level, modify it in some way, make it unique, and then just verify the functionality, and there easily is 20 extra points. So you can definitely see how some of these features are more complex than others, and again, they fall into the 3 subcategories. So with that, that will conclude the lecture. You are free to go or free to stick around for lab. I'm going to stop the recording, but I'm also going to answer the questions that we have here in lab as well, or here in lecture, as well as on the chat. Okay. All right. Thank you all very much.